for our second Career Insights. They're both product directors, and I'm super excited because they manage really different games. We have them here to talk about their career journey, team management, and how to make strategic product decisions with very different constraints. So hope you enjoyed this episode. Tell us what you think about our Career Insights series. And without further ado, handing over to Jake.
Thank you, Kat. And hi again, Anna and Kate. Super pleased to have you here with us today. I guess since we're talking about career insights, let's start with I guess 101. Can you tell us a little bit more about your professional background? How does your day-to-day look like? Shall we start with you, Anna?
Yeah, sure. So first, thank you for the invite, for being here. I'm super excited for the chat. So talking a little bit about my background, I'm a mechanical engineer, and I've had a little bit of experience on management consulting before joining Wildlife. So I've been at Wildlife for almost 4 years. Today I manage 2 different products, Tennis Splash and War Machines. And I joined the company as an associate product manager, and well, it was a long way until this product director position, and it's been a great opportunity. For those who don't know Wildlife, so Wildlife is a mobile game company. We focused on free-to-play games. And we started in Brazil, but today we are a true global company with offices in Brazil, Argentina, Ireland, and the US. And the way we are structured, today we have game teams, and each game team has a game director who is responsible for the P&L, is responsible for this small company, as we like to say. And we have the publishing teams, so they are bigger teams that help the game teams to develop more specific parts of the product, as user acquisition, ads monetization, and etc. And I think that's it, a little bit about myself and about Wildlife.
Amazing, thank you. What about you, Kate?
Hi, everybody. Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm very excited, and it's always nice to connect with other panelists and to just be in touch with other amazing women in the industry. So my background, I actually did not ever think I would be in gaming. I did my degree in finance, and then I realized that's really not me. Not super into investments and all those things that have to do with banking. So I had my internship with a food startup. So food aside, I realized that I want to work for a startup. So the fact that I work in gaming was purely based on the fact that I was looking for a startup, and being in San Francisco at the time put me in touch with a lot of startups, and gaming was just a coincidence. I just happened to join a gaming startup. And when I joined, we were 5 people. I didn't really know what I'm good at, because gaming, especially mobile gaming, was such a new space, and that was 9 years ago. So actually back then it was Facebook gaming, right? And then that transitioned into mobile, and I was part of that transition. So that was pretty amazing to be a part of. And I started as a LiveOps manager, and it was just kind of a made up, I kind of go back and think, okay, today this is what it's called. Back then my title was completely like random and made up because there was no standard titles. So now I have to kind of go back and adjust what my title was. But in reality, I was in charge of kind of building up a system, because the system didn't exist. So I was kind of doing that on one side, working with the developers on building the system that would allow us to target players, segment players, give them different offers. And on the other side, I was optimizing price points, working on lifecycle flows. So that was kind of my entry into the gaming space. And then I was just, lucky enough to work for a gaming company called Product Madness that was growing and got acquired a year later. And then we launched amazing products. So I grew with the company. So there is a bit of a luck there, but I also obviously put a lot of effort. So I guess that's a bit of a professional background. And I think, if there are any more questions on the details, how I transitioned, then I'm happy to answer that as well.
Amazing. Can you tell us a little bit about the studio in MobilityWare? How is it structured? How does the team works? How does
Sure. So MobilityWare is a 30-year-old company. So it's been around for a really long time. And actually, the 3 of the MobilityWare companies were the first games to be launched on the App Store. So one of them, Solitaire, is the, Solitaire we all know from back in the day on PCs. And MobilityWare was the first one to just kind of be like, "Ooh, that sounds interesting. Why don't we build that?" And then they went to Apple and were the first ones to be launched there. So has a huge kind of loyalty following base because people have played the game for forever. And so that's, I think, our like flagship title. So the way the company is built is we have 2 separate studios, separate in kind of how the teams work, the structures, but they're all in the same geolocation. But one studio is working on the card games, so Solitaire, Mahjong, all the kind of parlor games as well. And then the studio that I'm a part of, we are on puzzle games, including jigsaw, word puzzle, kind of all kind of casual games. So that's the structure, and it's about an even split as far as number of people in each org. And I oversee 3 different teams. They work on different number of games. Yeah, I think that's kind of high level.
Amazing. And since both of you, it seems like both of you didn't come from a games background, and you came from mechanical engineering background, Anna, and you came from finance, Kate. Would you say you're both a big gamer, a big mobile gamer? Do you play any games apart from your own games? And if so, what are they? What do you play now? Anna, do you want to start? What games do you play?
Yeah. So I'm definitely a gamer. So I play. So I could list some of them, but I think what I play the most right now is Brawl Stars. And actually, it's the one that I'm playing the most for some years. Yeah. So what thrills the most about Brawl Stars is that there is always a next goal. Also, there is always a next quest to be completed, a next character to master, and I can play hours and hours of it. But I also like to play chess a lot, so kind of old school, but it was part of my youth, and I still play some chess. And I'm also playing a lot of a new game from Wildlife. It's called Suspects. It's still in beta, so maybe not available to everyone here, but it's super fun. It's like an imposter game, and I'm super. I'm playing a lot with my friends. Yeah.
Amazing. What about you, Kate? What are you playing?
So a lot of the games that I play are from the kind of competitors, doing the research and making sure we're staying up to date and don't miss kind of important shifts. Those are really fun games too, right? So I like the game is called Woodoku, which is from one of our competitors. It's actually a London-based company. So if you're looking for a job, I would suggest look into that. So they have some really, really great games. My personal favorite that has nothing to do with work would be Match 3. They're all kind of great. Homescapes, Gardenscapes, Matchington Mansion, all of those, all day, every day is bad. I sometimes have to uninstall them. And then months later, I'm like, all right, I'm ready now. It's like caffeine addiction, you need to take a break and then you kind of go back to it. So yeah, I think Homescapes is probably my favorite game.
For sure. I am a big Clash Royale addict. I think all of my colleagues know that's the first and only game that I've stayed for, I don't know, 5 years since they first launched. I think it was March 2015 or something. I've been playing every single day. I play at least I would say at least 5 games a day, because like the games, each match was so short. So I'm a huge Clash Royale player. Also word domination. I feel like I like competitive games. that they usually take a lot longer time to get into. But once I know a little bit about how to play it, then I can't get out. So really bad, really addictive personalities. So we talk a little bit about your roles as product managers and product directors. Do you think, you know, as the more decisions that you need to make for games increases, what do you think are the best skills that good product directors should have, and how do you suggest people in our audience get better if that's what they're aiming to achieve? Shall we start with you first, Kate?
Sure. So my observation, and it's probably very kind of subjective and personal, is that you don't really have more decision-making power, because something that I am historically really good at is being an individual contributor, right? You rely on yourself, you go figure it out, you implement it, analyze it, boom, done. And advancing through my career, that was the biggest opportunity for improvement and growth for me, kind of delegating, right? And look at me now, I'm just delegating right and left all day. And I think as you advance, you actually have very talented people who work for you, right? And they always say you surround yourself with people who are better than you. And I don't think at the director of product level you're quite there. I think it's more of a like position where you're like, I have people who are better than me. So what I find is that, you know, working with very talented people, it's hard to tell them what to do. So a lot of it is just trying to convince people. So it's very infrequent that I can be like, no, we're doing it this way. A, it's not my management style. B, it just doesn't fit the culture we have at MobilityWare, or Product Madness where I worked before. So I think you have to be knowledgeable, you have to ask the right questions, and then by asking the questions, you show your experience, your knowledge, the fact that you can think about edge cases and kind of put yourself in the shoes of the player and be kind of user-centric. So in my mind, your experience comes through the questions that you ask and how you push the team to consider different scenarios. But as far as direct decision-making, that doesn't happen, unfortunately. So I have to communicate and collaborate with the teams. And then as far as how do you develop those skills, playing a lot of the games kind of trains you. You just develop this innate feeling and perspective of how good games are done and what triggers you. And you kind of can assume that that's how other players would react to different features and mechanics. So playing a lot of the games, and nothing can beat experience just by doing the work, right? And sometimes people feel they're ready for the next step as far as kind of being advanced and getting promotions. And what my old boss used to say at Product Madness, who's now working for Scopely. So he used to say that sometimes people don't realize the gap between where they are and where I want them to be ready for that position. So I think nothing beats just pure sweat, you know, doing things, learning from your mistakes.
Thank you. What about you, Anna? Any thoughts to add?
Yeah, so I think I agree 100% with Kate in this matter. So of course, with the experience, the technical knowledge has to increase with the responsibilities as well. And I think this knowledge, as she said, comes from studying the industry, either playing all sorts of games or understanding market trends or analyzing the data that you have available from your own game. But I think it's important for a product director to choose the right people to be in their team and to empower those people to take the best decisions. So to help them understand, to ask what is the gap, for example, or asking the right questions and sharing a different view about the problem they are working on. But I think the secret, if I may say, is choosing the right people to be on your team and empowering them to take the best decisions possible.
Amazing.
Yeah, I
Thank
agree.
you. Okay, you mentioned a little bit about mistakes and learning from your mistakes. Can you share one of your mistakes that you've done in the industry, and how did you learn from it?
I think mistakes are, there could be just as small as learning a new tool or being new to a company and you have to use the tool. And, you know, when my direct reports would kind of join the team, I always feel like they need to work on smaller scale projects and setups to make the mistakes, because that's how you learn, right? You can understand everything in theory, but unless you start using it, implementing it, you won't really understand it fully. You have to make mistakes. So I always am super comfortable with people being like, oh, I messed up here. And I'm like, well, we've learned. Now we know not to do that. As far as personal mistakes, I think they are just, you know, not shutting down a feature soon enough, kind of committing to kind of trying to improve something where it's not working, and you're just spending resources, spending the time on something that just it is not going to work. It was not the right decision to start with. So I think a lot of the managers or you know, product people that I talk to kind of experience the same thing, that, you know, you feel like it was your baby to start with and now you're committed to make it work. You just need to cut down things that don't move on and see what does work. Another, which is kind of confusing, but another problem is that sometimes, and I'm, you know, guilty of the same, is that you would think of a feature or an improvement and you think of it in terms of an MVP, right? What is the minimum thing you can introduce to test your concept? The problem with that is that if you do it in a way where it's so minimal that it has no impact and makes no difference, then the management could say, well, that did not work, moving on. And you're like, but wait a second, there's this like roadmap of, you know, 5 other things we need to add to make it really work. We just wanted to test. And so I've seen features being dropped because either the management said that they don't work, or the team just doesn't feel strongly about it, the new stuff that you've introduced. So I think that's another kind of thing that you have to balance, and it's a really hard one, right? So just kind of say, be conscious of the fact that your MVP has to be good enough to move the metrics.
Yeah. Anna, you were nodding rigorously. Did you have the same experience?
Yes. I completely agree. So sunsetting a feature or even a game, I think it's one of the most difficult decisions to be taken. It's very hard. We put a lot of work in the feature, and sometimes we just think we have a path to fix it, and if we don't set like clear success criteria for the features, it's very easy to just keep working on that. Even on games, it happens with full games as well. I think another thing that I would add that is a kind of a challenge in the industry as a whole. So there is plenty of data available. So we know it's very easy to rely only on data to take your decision. So I want, in the beginning, I simply wanted to A/B test everything, and sometimes it's a little bit difficult to separate signal from noise, and we can just wait too long to take a decision that you could take through business sense or through other qualitative metrics by talking to your community, for example. And I think there is a right balance, and it's difficult to find this balance in the beginning, because it's easier to just have a report with the result. Well, let's choose A over B, and that's it, because it's proven. But sometimes you need to use your gut feeling to take decisions, or other tools available like your community.
Right. So you talk a little bit about success, it's hard to find successful features. How do you define if a feature, or how do you define the success then for this feature? What are the KPIs that you look for? What are the indications that you look for when you talk about success? Anna, can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Okay, yeah, sure. I think it depends on the feature. So I think the output metric that we want to optimize usually is LTV. So there are very different ways to look at the LTV, to estimate the LTV actually, because if you don't track your player's life cycle for 2 years, 3 years, you don't actually know the real LTV. So we have to use tools to estimate that. And I think LTV is a good output metric because it's a composition of engagement and monetization, right? So it depends on how long a player stays in the game and how much they are willing to spend. But as I said, it's an output metric. Sometimes we have to go one level lower, like to check the input metrics for the LTV. So for example, for a clan feature, maybe this input metric could be the percentage of players that engage a clan. And you want to optimize this because you know that this metric has a good correlation with the LTV. Because once a player is in a club, they are more engaged, they are more, their willingness to spend is higher, and etc. So I think it's kind of art to find the right input metrics. So you have to spend a lot of time and to put a good amount of thought to find those metrics that correlates with your LTV and that are more controllable, because sometimes your LTV is not super controllable. You see, it depends on the mix, it depends on other factors. And if you are able to find good input metrics, you are able to manage better your game. Yeah.
Thank you. What about you, Kate? For you, what is success? How do you define success for a feature?
Yeah, I thought that was a really good answer. If I were to add anything, I would say that sometimes I find that when teams approach new features, they get focused on the mechanics of the features and what is fun, and not necessarily focus on what are the KPIs that they're trying to improve. Because what happened in my experience a few times is that you would think this is a great feature, we see the competitors doing that, and then you kind of build it, and then it kind of touches the most on the KPI that you are already very strong in, right? Or you would kind of keep developing features that lean into the same behavior improvement that all the other features. So I think it's super important to identify that where the gaps are, right? And I think the LTV approach is super strong because you could have the same LTV as your user base would have the same LTV as your competitor, but that's because they have much stronger monetization while you have the strongest retention. So if you try to do something that keeps improving retention, you might have already reached the ceiling. You might have already tapped out. There's nowhere to improve. Or if you work on improving how long people play, well, based on some of the analyses we've done at my previous company, we know that it's really hard to make the session longer. People have 10 minutes a day, so you just need to extract, and it kind of sounds negative, but I don't mean it's extract value in a negative way, but like it has to be fun enough for them to play more games if that moves your KPI, or keep coming back more often. So I think a successful feature is the one that touches on the KPIs that you're trying to improve. Because another problem sometimes I see is that you try to do one thing and then you forget that your original KPIs were, to improve X, and then the results come back as it's improved Y, and you're like, success, it's improving something. And in reality, it's maybe not as meaningful or relevant to the original idea. So starting with the KPIs in mind, I think is super important.
Interesting. But as product directors, how do you prioritize then when it comes to importance? Do you think game design, engagement, retention first, or does UA goes first, or does monetization goes first? How do you think of these kind of prioritization when it comes to these elements? Anna, do you have any thoughts to share?
Yes. Yeah. So the way I think about it, so at least for the games that we make at Wildlife, gameplay is a fun. Gameplay is what differentiates a game, and we try to really craft the gameplay experience, game design, the progression, etc. And we see user acquisition and monetization per se, because when we are designing a game, of course, we have monetization in mind, but the purely area of trying to optimize the LTV by adding new features, optimizing price points, etc. Those things we see as a service, and that's why we think the knowledge is more shareable between games, and we think we can gain scale with bigger teams and etc. And we do this, as I mentioned before, we do this with publishing teams that work on optimizing those levers that are important. But on the game teams, we try to focus a lot on the gameplay because we think that it's the creative part of the process, thus the one that is harder to scale. So we have to be super focused on this, crafting the player experience, guaranteeing that your game is super fun, and then UA and monetization come second.
Interesting. What about you, Kate?
Yeah, I agree. And I think my answer is very similar because that's what I can control, right? We have a different team who's doing UA. And I think in most gaming companies, UA sits separately from the game teams. So I can't control that. Therefore, I'm going to lean towards thinking that design has to come first, because unless your game is fun and people want to play, there is no need in monetization or UA. So that definitely comes first. Another philosophy of mine, obviously not an original thinking that, but if you have engagement metrics that are strong and you have retention, you can figure out how to monetize your users. So monetization, super important, because unless you figure that out, there's, you can't scale your business. But I think engagement definitely comes first. And just to go back to the UA part for a second, I have heard statements that game is growing because of UA, right? You can have the same set of features. You could have, and I don't know this, but I would imagine very similar KPIs. Companies don't share that, but you can imagine just because you see that the game is very similar. But UA is what makes it or breaks it, right? If your team is able to find users that are high quality users at CPIs that are 30% lower, so the cost per install, 30% lower, or you find geos where you get a lot of organic installs that monetize, that makes a huge impact. So UA is critical, but I think you kind of have to be responsible for things you can control, which is monetization hooks and thinking about features with those monetization hooks in mind. My more recent experience with MobilityWare is working with ad-based monetization models. So historically, I come from a space which is very, very in-app monetization driven. So ad-based is very new to me, and I'm learning a lot, and I think it's super fascinating. So their engagement and retention are even more critical because you literally do not have things to sell. It's all about how do you monetize your users and how do you make sure that your ads are coming in naturally in the flow and not disruptive and things like that. So just kind of a different beast, but yeah, engagement definitely comes first.
because you mentioned, I guess, user acquisition and how do you get those organic installs. I'm curious to see if what are your thoughts on organic installs versus paid UA? Do you still see the same value that store featuring have on games, or do you think actually store featuring, is past its prime and actually UA now gets more quality or installs as it's more favorable channels for you to get this installed? What do you think, Kate?
Organic installs are amazing because they're free. So we'll take them any day. So anytime we can get a store featuring, yes, please. And we would have, obviously relationships with reps from Apple, from Google, kind of pitching our upcoming games or features to get them excited and get that featuring because it's free users. However, when we do get featured, we would get, if it's ad-based monetization model, that's great because you get all these new users that you can monetize. However, if it's something like store featuring, it does not usually translate into high quality users long term, right? So you just get this huge spike and then they kind of trickle down and dissipate, and you have your kind of loyal user base over time. So that's specific to store featuring. On the organic installs besides the store featuring, just the ones that go out of their way to find your app, those are very high quality, right? And it depends on different apps and user acquisition mix where you get your installs from. But generally speaking, organic installs are more valuable, especially long term, because they are the ones that find you and kind of go proactively looking for you. And yeah, paid UA is super important. There are all these algorithms that look at your volume of installs, your ranking in the store. So there are all these strategies where you would have, you would try to get as high as possible in the store, just so you can boost your organic installs. So I think there's a lot of science to it, but also it's an art, right? So yeah.
Cool. What about you, Anna? Any thoughts to add?
Yeah, I agree, and I see. So I see a lot of a reinforcement cycle between organic and paid. So I think both are important, and doing well on both just increases your chances of growing even faster. So, for example, if you are being able to acquire users because you have found a creative that performs better, let's say 30% better than your past creative, which would translate on 30% less CPI, and you are acquiring more users. So it's a bigger player base talking about your game. So there is this multiplication, mouth to mouth. Sorry. But there is also like an increase in rankings and the increase of organic installs because you have more visibility in the store. So I think it's very important to focus on both. Always trying to optimize your store, keywords, getting features, super important. As Kate said, usually the average user coming from features, they are worse in terms of lifetime value, but even though they are free, so always an extra over your baseline. So it's great. And I think we should never underestimate the power of the mouth-to-mouth multiplication. I think it's very important in the games industry as well, because if we have a very valuable user, very engaged user, the likelihood that they will refer your game to a person that is similar to them and will be as engaged as they are is higher. So we should explore this. Yeah, so both are super important. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. Let's talk a little bit about LiveOps, because you both have a wealth of experience running LiveOps in games. What do you think are some of the key things that a developer should keep in mind when they're deploying a LiveOps strategy. Can you share an example based on your experience? Shall we start with you, Kate?
Yeah. I think, again, it has to start with KPIs, because over and over, people just come up with creative ideas without thinking about what is it they're trying to achieve. So I think that's just my message over and over again. Think about the KPIs first and foremost. My second approach to LiveOps would be thinking of how to scale it, right? It has to be something that you can reuse easily through either reskinning it. So for example, what I mean is that if you have some kind of a collection feature that you're running through LiveOps, it has to take just a couple of days to change the background of the feature, the collections you were changing. Like it can be like a feature effort requirement. It's on the engineering and the art side. So you have to think about, LiveOps by definition is something that you implement once and let your LiveOps team run with, right? On the engineering side, it should require no client release, no server deployments. So that's something that you need to think about. How do you build it once and don't touch it? That ideally, in my opinion. And then you would also see examples from casual titles, from like any sorts of games where LiveOps could be literally the same event done over and over again. It's just something that happens once a month and you're familiar with that feature and it works. And so I think there's nothing wrong with reusing something that you've done once. You don't even need to reskin it. So those would be the two things that I would definitely keep in mind when it comes to LiveOps. And something we talked about earlier, you have different monetization models, and something that works really well with in-app purchases based models versus ad-based models. Those are different designs. I was doing a presentation the other day, and that's something that I was focusing pretty heavily on. That if you look at best in class in IAP, because that's what the top grossing games are, and you want to build the same event for your ad-based game, that's just likely not going to work. So just understanding your monetization models and kind of leaning into that, I think is super critical.
That's interesting, because I always thought that events have to be new, like every month or so. It can't be reused.
Yeah, I've seen events like, for example, in Clash of Clans. I'm sure I'm not a huge player of that game, but I'm sure there are events that are either the same or very similar, and they have the same, or they have like a frequency of like once a month, once every 2 months, and you're like, oh, I remember that one, it's really cool, it gives me this really unique reward I care about. And I think it's totally fine rerunning the same stuff.
Interesting. What about you, Anna? What do you think about it when you start running?
Yeah. So what I would add on Kate's response is that I think a good LiveOps strategy starts with the conception of the game. So the earlier you think about LiveOps in the life cycle of the game, the better. So if you think about the economy of the game, consumable items, non-consumable items, what are the events that you can create, how can you cycle them? So the earlier you think about those things, the better. And I think I agree with Kate that you can reuse events, definitely. So I've seen this working a lot. So on more machines, for example, one of the games that I'm responsible for, we run but a weekly event, actually, the Clone Wars, and like it's one of the core social mechanics of the game, and it's there for 1 year, so people really engage with that. And I think it's important to think about LiveOps since the beginning. It is possible to just establish a LiveOps strategy once the game is live, but I think it's more artificial. So if you have enough content or at least you design your economy thinking about having, adding more and more content, it's easier. And also one thing that I find important, especially in regards to offers, is to find the right metric to optimize. So it's very common mistake to just try to optimize conversion of the offers, for example, by increasing discount.
Yeah.
And we know that this generates hangover, but maybe we are talking about an artificial intelligence model, and we use this as an optimizing metric, and we are not really understanding what is happening in this black box of the AI model and etc. So it's super important to think about, as Kate said, what are the KPIs that you want to optimize. So in the case of offers or of LiveOps as a whole, we always want to optimize LTV, and it's tricky to measure LTV optimizations. So we have to really be careful about it. So at Wildlife, we try always to estimate LTV through like either measuring the performance of a test for a little bit of more time. So you track the users for some weeks or months before taking the decision. But I think, yeah, so I think this is super tricky because giving discounts in your offers, it's not necessarily bad. So inflating your economy is not necessarily bad as long as you create content at the same pace. So if you are able to always insert new content, for example, new characters in your game, and even if the average price of our gem reduces over time, it is okay. But to find the right balance, you need to experiment a lot, and you need to measure the right metrics.
Yeah. When you say experiment, do you mean targeting players based on regional pricing as a blanket? So for example, we know that in certain countries the spending power is lower. So for those countries, you can actually put the offers price lower, whereas for the US, you would naturally put the price higher. Or
yeah, usually, yeah, that's a great point. So usually this is one of the features that we can use to optimize an offer model. So usually it's a composition of many and many metrics. So we try to target the player itself, like just not only considering their countries, but also their spend velocity or how they interact with the game, with each features and etc. So I think it's a composition of all of that. So today we have AI models that make this kind of optimizations easier. So we can just put a lot of features, as we say, but we're talking about metrics. So to let the model find the variables that correlates the most with long-term spending.
Interesting. And do you think managing like older titles, would you consider as a challenge, because you're both running games that are 3 years and above? Do you consider that as a challenge in terms of finding new players, trying to convert these players, or actually it's much easier than developing a game from start? Shall we start with you, Kate? Because your games are pretty of age these days.
Yeah, I think the biggest game I'm working with now is pretty old, mature. Let's call it mature. It's been around for quite a few years. There are a bunch of other games that are less than 1 year old, and so I'm actually getting a pretty cool balance as far as different experiences. What do you do on a more mature title? And when it comes to a mature title, what's important is that how successful that title is, right? So if it contributes a lot to the top line, then the challenges there are that you can't really be very adventurous or take a lot of risks, right? So a lot of it would come down to balancing optimizations. And when I mean optimizations, I mean small changes, right? 1% here, 2% there, 2% there. It really does add up versus spending 9 months on this big, massive feature, releasing it, it didn't do anything. So you kind of wasted 9 months of dev time on no results at the end. So I think for older titles, it's optimization and very careful rollout of new features. So when we think of new features for existing titles that have been around for a while, something that's super important in my experience is making sure that you release it to a very small user base. And I think in theory, everybody knows that, but sometimes, designers or game owners would think that, well, there would be no damage. Let's roll it out to everybody. And it's just the only control you have is on or off for the feature. But then you can't target different users. You can't release it only to say 5 or 10% to see how it performs. So it is really, it comes down to putting more hooks and I guess controls for the feature. So that's more time and more resources that go into pre-production and engineering just to allow you to control the feature. But I always find that to be a better approach than targeting everybody and just turning on a feature. And I've seen that happen and it usually doesn't end very well. So yeah, the challenges are understanding your user base very well, being careful with changes, right? If somebody has played your game for 2-3 years and now you think you want to improve it and you do something and they're like, what have you guys done? I loved your game as is. Like, what is this? Have to be very careful with that. On newer titles, you have a lot more freedom because just by definition, a new title has a very small user base often, unless you go out with a bang with some massive IP and you have store featuring and all that. Usually you have soft launch and you have small user base to start with. So during the first couple of months, even up to a year, you can take risks, right? Add new big features, change the economy. In fact, you should change the economy or at least test and optimize. You can change a lot of things. And I think that's the fun part of working with newer titles, that you can be more creative and more adventurous.
Cool. Thank you. Anna, anything to add to it?
Yeah, I would just add that the bright side is that we can leverage our community, like having a stronger and bigger player base allows us to talk to our most engaged players and extract insights from them. And I think that establishing a good conversation with your players is getting more and more important.
Cool. Just before we wrap up, we have a couple of questions from the attendees that I'm going to read it out to you ladies. Thank you so much again for your time today. So the first one we have here is, what advice can you give for people who want to break into the industry, especially if you already have a lot of experience from a completely different industry? I think, Anna, you can share a little bit about your thoughts when you moved into here as well.
Yeah, I think usually I would advise you just to play a lot. So study the market, put yourself in the shoes of the team who built this product. So try to outline a hypothesis for why the team chose this or that. And I think this is a super interesting exercise. Every time you play, you try to understand how was the decision process. So what metrics would you look at if you were the game director or if you were the engineer for the game. I think this is super useful and super important today to get into the industry. So at least talking about wildlife, we really value people who plays a lot when we are recruiting. We want to know what games you play, what are your impressions of the good, the bad, and etc. What would you change? So I think this is a good start. So we should practice this a lot, because it's super useful once you are in the game industry.
Amazing. Kate, anything to add to that?
No, I think that's pretty spot on. Maybe just read some industry related articles as well, just to get in habit of using the right terms and understanding what people are talking about. And you have things like, blogs like Deconstructor of Fun. So that usually has a lot of good information. Just, that was my first job. I had nothing about gaming and I was supposed to know a lot about gaming. So I just kind of faked my way through the interview faked, I mean, like I didn't have the experience, but I sounded like I did, right? Because I used the right terms, I used the right concepts, and I played a lot of games just for the interview, the games that the company produced. So you just have to prepare and sound like you know what you're talking about, and then you'll learn on the job.
Play more games. Yes. Thank you. So the second question we have here: how do product directors' day-to-day lives change during the various phases of the product life cycle? Kate, do you want to start this one?
I would say a lot more involved early on. You just want to make sure that everybody buys into the concepts you're considering. There are so many decision-making steps, different milestones, and I think it's really important that everybody's on the same page as they go through these milestones. So I would say very involved at first. And the same is true in my experience when it comes to new features, more involvement during the pre-production and ideation, and then maybe around the A/B testing phase when you first launch it out. But once things are out and they're running smoothly, I find myself being very not as involved as early on.
Right. Thank you. What about you, Anna? How does your life change?
I think that during the prototype or beta phase it's all about design. So super involved on making the game better, more prone to do big shifts in the game if necessary, and testing them out. Once the game is live, I think, at least for myself, I spend a lot of time trying to understand the P&L, if I may say that. So even if user acquisition is not under my umbrella, so I'm responsible for the success of the game. So I'm always in touch with them, always in touch with the development team, thinking about the vision of the game in terms of new features, what we want to roll out, what we want to build as a game, what are our flaws, what we need to improve in terms of metrics. But I think it's, as Kate said, so once the game is live, there is less focus on design, but not less focus, but there is more things to look at. I would say like this, but yeah, and at this moment, at least for myself, I see the game as a company, and we have to make sure that it's profitable and it's working fine, that our customers are happy, and etc.
Amazing. Okay. Last question. When do you feel it's time to move on a game to its sunset phase? Do you feel nostalgia ever impacts your decision? Kate, I guess we can start with you.
I think it's not really a very difficult question if you're data driven, right? It's easy to be emotionally attached, but if you use data, you could easily see that your cost per install is much higher than your LTV, therefore you just can't grow the game. And even if you have strong monetization but a small user base, And the problem there is that it's hard to build a team around the game that makes less than X, right? So if it's very kind of formula and P&L driven, you could see that having a team of 6, 7, 10, whatever it is, people on a title that makes less than whatever it has to be is no longer profitable. What you could do is, you could sunset the game as far as development support goes, but you can still have LiveOps on it. And that's why it's so important what we talked about earlier, building something that doesn't require consecutive client releases, so that you have a team that still runs LiveOps, still does sales and does optimization on the offer side. And I've seen a lot of games continue maintaining their games that way. And it's very ROI positive and effective.
And anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think it's similar. So I think even with all the data available, we are humans and we have hope. So it's natural to be attached and to delay a decision, or even to just have conviction that you were able to improve the game, to improve that LTV, to improve the art, to decrease CPI or whatever. So I like the concept of farming for dissent. So whenever I have to take a decision that I may be emotionally involved, I'd like to hear from other people. So those are the metrics. What would you do if you were in my shoes? So I think this it's a good practice, so you can have more neutral views over the decision.
Cool. Sorry, I just have one last question jumping in before we close this. So we have one of the attendees said he or she is a gamer, and he has done some courses focused in the games industry, but the CV was refused before during interviews. Can you share some other tips for someone like this trying to break into the industry? Would an internship help, for example, working in the games industry? Do you look at this in CVs before you hire someone? Any thoughts, Kate, maybe?
I think it depends where you are in your career right now and how determined you are to change the jobs and change the industry. Because if I wanted to go into, I don't know, pharmacy or healthcare, I would probably need to start with an internship at a very low level, just because it's crucial to have that. Like, I can't just be a director of a pharmaceutical company, you know what I mean? So I think if you feel determined to make a shift, it could be worthwhile, spending a couple of months on an internship and kind of pivoting that way. On the other hand, I just feel like it could be a numbers game, right? If your CV got declined once, I think it's, and I assume that you've applied more than once. So if you, spend a couple of months sending your CV, kind of dedicate one day a week to spend, a couple of hours and send 10 CVs, and then after a month you still feel like you're not getting anywhere, then consider an internship. But I think it's worth just playing the numbers game and just keep trying your luck.
Yeah, keep going. I sent out, I think, 300 or 400 CVs before I end up with an internship at Miniclip. So if that gives you hope. Sorry, time's running up. Kat's giving me the time's up, so I have to end here. Thank you so much, ladies, for your time today. Really appreciate this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think this was great, and I think one of the 3 big things is focus on engagement first, and monetization and UA can always follow. The big thing I learned was, for new features, focus on small to small audiences and don't waste so much time on a big feature to everybody and it falls flat. Tamir, coming into gaming, to re-emphasize Jabin's point, I think a lot of it is tough. Going to a new industry is tough. And at least when I was at King, there were people who were, you know, very mid-career level, and they were interning from scratch again. And there was one individual who'd been working for over 10 years, and she decided she wanted to go into games, and she worked as an intern, and you know, she was very, very senior. So I think it's really tough when you want to make a career change, and it's something you really want to do. I think it's definitely possible. But yeah, it's a numbers game, and you really might have to start from scratch. And I think if you have made 20 applications, it might not even be enough. You know what I mean? It's you need to keep going. But anyway, thanks so much, Anna. This was so great sharing your experiences, and like, I think it's great that you shared so much and so many practical things, both for career and for technical aspects. So thanks so much again.